Caroline Webber's fingers were still shaking from the slap when Lady Webber pressed a quill between them and said, "Do try to be useful for once." The breakfast things had not yet been cleared. Toast crumbs lay beside silver-warmed eggs gone stiff with cooling fat, and the tea in Lady Webber's cup had formed a pale skin that trembled each time she lifted it. Sunlight spilled through the high windows of the breakfast room and caught the dust above the table, turning it almost golden. It made everything look gentle that was not. Caroline stood because Lady Webber had never liked her seated in company. She had learned to hold still through worse than open-handed blows, but this one had landed unexpectedly, just as she reached for the account book, and now her pulse beat in the sore place along her cheekbone. She lowered her head before anyone could note the colour rising there and bent over the papers spread before her stepmother. Debts, notes of obligation, a packet of correspondence tied with green ribbon, fat as a fist. "Copy these cleanly," Lady Webber said, tapping the topmost page with one ringed finger. "Mr. Pritchard comes at noon. If your hand is legible, perhaps he will not assume this house entirely ungoverned." Caroline did not answer at once. She had learned in the 4 years since her father's death and her stepmother's transformation from distant hostess to sovereign tyrant that silence could save as much as speech. She dipped the quill. The nib scratched across paper, exact and narrow. Names, sums, dates, collateral. At 22 she had become expert at making herself small while her mind remained sharp. Lady Webber called her plain often enough to make it doctrine, and the rest of London accepted it readily because plain girls did not threaten anyone. Plain girls wore old mourning colours too long. Unremarkable daughters chose ink over flirtation. Girls no one notices, lowered their eyes and forgot to smile. Yet when Caroline passed a mirror and looked before she could stop herself, she saw not plainness, but a face gone serious. Dark hair she pinned too severely. Wide eyes she kept guarded. A fine-boned mouth that seemed always on the verge of speaking, and then thought better of it. She had not been bred to docility. Her father had taught her double-entry accounting and Latin tags from his favourite historians. He had once set a folio of military maps before her and asked where she would position supply trains if roads flooded in spring. He had laughed when she argued with him. "Think first," he would say, "obey afterward, if obedience still appears sensible." Those words had become habit after he died. She kept his books catalogued in a locked press no one else touched. She balanced household accounts in her own cipher when the official ledger grew suspiciously vague. She listened. By noon she knew why the debt papers had been laid out before breakfast had gone cold. Lady Webber dismissed the maid, sent Caroline's little half-brother Philip upstairs to his tutor, and instructed the footman to admit no callers until she rang. Then she sat back in her chair and watched Caroline with a smile that had ruined better mornings than this one. "Since you are so fond of figures, my dear, you will appreciate the generosity of this arrangement." Lady Webber lifted one of the freshly copied notes and waved it, not reading so much as enjoying the rustle of threat. "The estate in Kent cannot sustain another quarter's losses. Your father's annuity is spent, and creditors are beginning to lose patience. I have found a remedy." Caroline set down her quill. "If this concerns Philip's school fees, I can—" "It concerns your future?" Lady Webber's smile widened. "Or what remains of it." She let the words settle, then continued with lazy satisfaction. "You are to be married. This week." Caroline felt, absurdly, that she had misheard some common word. Married. Week. Remedy. She looked at the papers again, seeking sense in columns where none had been intended. To whom? The Duke of Rathmore. The name landed like a dropped plate. Shock first, then the ringing aftermath. Even Caroline, who had no interest in salons and little patience for whispered scandal, knew the stories. Rathmore, hero of Spain and Portugal. Rathmore, whose face had been ruined in the war. Rathmore, who had returned to England and vanished into his northern holdings. Rathmore called the Beast by women who had never met him, and men who wanted to pretend courage required beauty. Rathmore, who had not spoken in 12 years. Caroline's voice came out level only because she held it by force. And how precisely was this decided? Lady Webber spread her hands. By gentlemen who understand necessity. He requires a duchess before leaving London. We require relief from certain obligations. You require... Her glance slid over Caroline's old black gown, paused at the mended cuff, and sharpened. Any respectable offer that presents itself. It is a fortunate convergence. Caroline thought of her father's townhouse, now technically Lady Webber's by marriage settlement, but still bearing his taste in every shelf and hinge. She thought of the mortgage renewals that had multiplied over 2 years, each explained away with a charming laugh and a note about temporary inconvenience. She thought of Philip, 11 years old and earnest, who wrote her from school about Euclid as if triangles were heroic. You mean to trade me for debt relief? Lady Webber did not bother to deny it. Do not be vulgar. I mean to secure this family. This family? Caroline repeated softly. Or your jewels? The slap from earlier had not taught obedience after all. Lady Webber's eyes flashed, but before she could answer, the butler announced Mr. Gresham, solicitor to His Grace the Duke of Rathmore. The disruption came with law books, wax seals, and a man too careful for gossip. Mr. Gresham was narrow-shouldered, iron-haired and courteous in the manner of someone accustomed to difficult rooms. He bowed to Lady Webber, then to Caroline, and laid a leather portfolio on the table as if setting down a loaded pistol. Lady Webber, Miss Weber. He glanced once at the clock. I apologise for urgency, but His Grace departs for his northern seat in 3 days. We must execute a special licence and settlement contract by then, or not at all. Not at all, was offered as neutral fact. Lady Webber smiled as if she had ordered it. Mr. Gresham opened the portfolio. The documents were immaculate, each page stitched with blue ribbon and stamped where signatures would bind lives to law. Caroline read while the others watched her read. There would be a separate marriage settlement in her name, a dowry from Rathmore's side larger than anything Lady Webber had ever hinted might exist, protection clauses regarding issue dower rights and maintenance independent of household discretion. It was, on paper, an unusually careful instrument. Too careful. His Grace insists upon these terms, Gresham said, perhaps mistaking her pause for ignorance. Your personal allowance cannot be encumbered by prior family debt, nor may it be assigned without your written consent. Lady Webber let out a little laugh. How modern! Caroline did not look up. Why me? The solicitor's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. 1 fraction less professional, 1 fraction more human. His Grace chose your name. On what acquaintance? He did not specify. Of course he had not. A man who did not speak would not be interrogated by his own lawyer in another household's breakfast room. The interview went on. Dates were proposed, witnesses listed, church named. Every practical matter advanced with brisk inevitability, as if emotion were an error in arithmetic. At last Gresham closed the portfolio and stood. I shall return tomorrow for signatures. If there are objections, they must be raised by then. When he had gone, Lady Webber waited until the front door shut before turning to Caroline with the softness she reserved for cruelty. You will sign, she said. Let us save theatrics. Caroline met her gaze. No. Lady Webber sighed, almost fond. You always mistake stubbornness for principle. Shall I explain our position plainly?" She reached for another paper, one Caroline had copied that morning without yet knowing what it was, and slid it across the table. It was a notice from Philip's school, fees overdue by 1 term, warning of immediate dismissal. Another note beneath it from the school steward informed Lady Webber that no extension could be granted. Lady Webber tapped the notice. "Your brother's place vanishes by month's end, unless this house settles accounts. Creditors are less patient than governesses, my dear. Boys with no money go home. If you refuse this marriage, Philip returns here to be educated by no one, and his prospects die before his voice changes." The room narrowed around Caroline. She heard Philip in memory, reading Greek verbs by the fire, looking up to ask if she thought he might one day go to university. She had said yes, because to say less would have been betrayal. Lady Webber leaned back. "And before you imagine heroic economies, sell your dresses, dismiss servants, pawn the silver, understand that these debts are secured against assets you cannot touch. You have no legal authority here, none. You are a dependent, Caroline, a dependent with fading looks and no dowry. Be grateful someone is willing to take you, even at discount." There it was. The final needle slid in with a smile. A single tear escaped before Caroline could stop it. She wiped it away with the heel of her hand, angry at the evidence more than the pain. Then she drew the school notice toward her, folded it once, and placed it beside the settlement copy. "When?" "Friday. That is 4 days. 3 if you exclude today." Caroline stood, gathered the documents, and said, "I will read every line tonight." Lady Webber blinked, surprised by compliance where she had expected pleading. "By all means. It will improve your handwriting if nothing else." Caroline left before she said something irretrievable. In the small room that had once been her father's dressing closet and was now hers by demotion, she laid the contract out on the bed and read until candlelight blurred the edges. She marked clauses in pencil. She calculated, recalculated. The terms truly did wall off her settlement from Lady Webber's reach, unless she were foolish enough to sign subsequent transfers. The marriage would cost freedom of one kind, and buy another kind she had not expected. Legal personhood, armoured by rank. It was still coercion. It was still a bargain made over her head. It was still a leap into a life governed by a stranger whose silence had become myth. But Philip would remain at school. Lady Webber would lose access to at least one source of money she had already begun to count. And Caroline, if she survived the humiliation of being bartered, might yet build a corner of autonomy no one could repossess. She signed the next afternoon. Not because she submitted, because she chose the weaker life to shield first, and would count the cost afterward. The wedding passed in a blur of satin, incense, and legal witnesses. Lady Webber cried decorously without wetting her powder. 2 members of the ton attended out of morbid curiosity and pretended piety. Mr. Gresham stood like a border post between worlds. Caroline wore ivory because black would have been called spiteful. The colour made her look, she thought, like someone else's ghost. She saw the Duke clearly for the first time at the church door. He was taller than Rumour, broader through the shoulders, and carried a cane, though he used it lightly, as if resenting the need. The left side of his face bore the history gossip had feasted on, old burn scars pulling from temple to jaw, one eyebrow split, skin ridged and pale against winter-dark hair. But his eyes, grey, steady, uncompromisingly alive, were not those of a beast nor of a broken man. They were the eyes of someone who had endured being looked at and learned to look back until others flinched first. When the rector asked for his vows, the Duke did not speak. Mr. Gresham supplied prepared affirmations as permitted under the special licence. Rathmore inclined his head at each line. then signed with a bold hand that indented the register page. Caroline gave her vows in her own voice. It sounded strange to her, clear in the vaulted church, as if someone braver had borrowed her throat. By week's end she was in a closed carriage, heading north, London dissolving behind rain-streaked glass. Beside her sat her husband, gloved hands folded over his cane, profile turned to the window. He acknowledged her once when they started, a formal bow more fitting a drawing room than a marriage coach. Then silence took the space between them and held it, complete and cold. Blackthorn Hall rose from mist at dusk, stone turrets, long wings, dark windows catching the last of the light like watchful eyes. Servants lined the steps as the carriage stopped. Some stared openly at her gown, her face, the new title that had arrived without courtship. Others kept their eyes trained on the gravel, as if refusal to see could alter what had happened. Inside, the air smelled of beeswax, wet wool, and old smoke. Portraits of dead Rathmores glowered down a corridor long enough to swallow echoes. A housekeeper curtsied with exact politeness and did not quite meet Caroline's eyes. A footman offered to show her Grace to her rooms in a tone that suggested recent memorization. The Duke removed his gloves, handed them to his valet, and turned to Caroline. For one absurd second she expected words now, if not warmth, then at least instruction. "Welcome to Blackthorn. You will dine at 8. I regret the circumstances. Anything." He gave her that same grave, formal bow he had given at the carriage. His scarred hand opened in a gesture inviting her forward. Then he stepped aside and said nothing at all. The silence that met her there was not empty. It had weight, age, architecture. It felt like winter shut inside walls. Caroline lifted her chin, set her hand on the banister, and walked into her new life, knowing exactly this. She had traded one kind of captivity for another whose locks she did not yet understand, and if she meant to keep herself, and those she loved, safe, she would need every page of her father's lessons, every ounce of patience, and a courage no one in this house expected her to possess. The banister was cold beneath her palm. A footman took her cloak, another reached for her travelling case, and hesitated, looking not at her but toward the Duke's valet for instruction. The valet, compact, dark-haired, efficient, gave a fractional nod, and only then did the servant move. So that was one law of Blackthorn established before she had crossed the entry. Everyone watched his Grace. No one moved until he willed it. "Her Grace's rooms are prepared," said the housekeeper, a straight-backed woman with iron-grey hair and a ring of keys at her waist. "If you please, your Grace," Caroline turned to her husband, "will we dine together?" The Duke met her eyes. A pause. Then he inclined his head once. The housekeeper led her up the broad staircase and along a corridor panelled in dark oak, her shoes making almost no sound on runners thick enough to swallow footsteps whole. Her rooms were at the south end, bedchamber, dressing room, and a small sitting room with a fire already built. Everything was proper, expensive, and impersonal. New curtains in winter blue, a writing desk set with untouched paper, a vase of white roses that smelled faintly of cold water. "Mrs. Fenwick will attend you in the mornings," the housekeeper said. "If there is anything wanting, ring." The statement was impeccable. The tone translated it. Do not expect warmth to accompany service. "Thank you," Caroline said. When the door closed, she stood very still in the middle of the room, listening to a house she did not yet understand. Pipes ticked behind the walls. Wind brushed the glass in long fingers. Somewhere below, a door thudded shut. She crossed to the writing desk and touched the blank top page, as if to steady herself on something known. At 8, she went down to dinner. The table in the lesser dining room could have seated 20. Tonight it held 2 place settings at opposite ends, and enough silver for 6. The Duke stood when she entered, bowed once, and resumed his seat only when she sat. A butler, Morrow she learned, served soup with military precision. No one asked what she preferred. No one asked anything. Caroline waited through the first course, then said, "I should like to know how you wish the household arranged." The Duke looked up. His expression did not harden. It simply closed like a door pulled to. He set down his spoon, reached beside his plate, and slid a small leather folio across to the butler. Morrow carried it the length of the table and placed it at Caroline's hand. Inside were cards, each with neat writing in a bold, masculine hand. House matters may be directed through Mrs. Keating, housekeeper. Estate matters through Mr. Pike, steward. Personal requirements through Mrs. Fenwick. If urgent, write directly. Caroline glanced at the Duke. He was watching her not with embarrassment, but with a grave patience she couldn't pass. "You do not use a valet to interpret?" she asked quietly. He made a brief gesture with 2 fingers. The valet at the sideboard, Mercer, spoke immediately. "His Grace does, when needed. At table, His Grace prefers written communication." "Prefers," Caroline repeated, and reached for her wine not because she wanted it, but because her hand needed occupation. "Very well." The meal continued in measured silence. Once, when the fish was replaced by roast pheasant, she caught 2 footmen exchanging a glance over the silver épergne, as if wagering whether the new Duchess would cry, rage, or beg by pudding. She did none of the 3. When dinner ended, the Duke stood, bowed again, and offered his arm for the walk to the withdrawing room. The gesture was flawless. His sleeve beneath her hand felt like armour. Morning revealed Blackthorn in iron detail, long courts rutted with cart tracks, stables the size of a village chapel, kitchens that ran on bells and hierarchy. Caroline rose early, dressed without calling Mrs. Fenwick, and asked for tea in the steward's office so she might review the household expenditure book. The clerk blinked. Grace wants the accounts?" "Yes." "Mr. Pike handles those." "Then Mr. Pike and I shall become friends." By noon she had learned 3 things. First, Blackthorn spent generously on horseflesh, coal, and repairs deferred too long. Second, no one expected a duchess to understand columns beyond dressmakers' invoices. Third, every answer she received was technically correct and strategically incomplete. The staff divided quickly into camps. Some treated her with polished obedience and concealed contempt, as one might a governess who had overreached. Others were openly uncertain whether she outranked them in practice. One scullery maid curtsied so deeply she nearly dropped a tray, then whispered, "Beg pardon, Your Grace," as if apologies was safer than conversation. Only Mrs. Keating remained neutral, and neutrality in such a house was almost kindness. On the 3rd day, Caroline tried to speak to her husband in the library before luncheon. The room was vast, laddered to the ceiling, windows high and narrow as church slits. He stood at a table of maps, cane propped against the edge, a pencil marking roads north of York. "Your steward says the tenant rolls are delayed." He looked up, then down to his folio. He wrote, tore off the sheet and handed it across, flooding damaged records in the lower office, copies being made. "You might have told me." His jaw moved once, attention not quite a flinch. He wrote again. "You were occupied settling in." "Settling in," she said, reading the phrase as one reads a polite refusal. "Of course." His hand tightened on the pencil until the wood creaked. For a moment she thought he might speak. Air gathered in his chest, his throat worked, but no sound came. He turned away first. By week's end she understood the mechanics of his silence. He was not absent from his own life. He governed everything. Orders travelled by note, by gesture, by Mercer's low voice translating a flick of fingers or tilt of head. Estate men came to him at dawn and left with pages of instructions. Architects unrolled plans. He annotated margins in ruthless detail. He rode out daily despite the limp inspected fields, checked drains, reviewed rents, and returned mud-splashed and unreadable. Yet, when conversation crossed from logistics into anything human, he withdrew behind paper. The household had grown used to that border. Caroline had not. The accident happened under a pale noon sky that promised sleet. She was crossing the yard toward the still room when a shout split the air. A high, terrified cry, then the heavy crash of horse and man going down together near the mounting block. Men turned. No one moved quickly enough. Caroline ran. The stable lad, Tom, she remembered now, 19 and broad-shouldered but still green, had been thrown sideways under the gelding's front legs. The horse, wild-eyed, struck once, twice before the groom caught the bridle and hauled its head clear. Tom screamed and then stopped, the sudden silence worse than the noise. His right leg lay wrong below the knee. "Don't lift him!" Caroline snapped as 2 hands reached in. "You'll make it worse!" She dropped to her knees in the mud, tore off her gloves with her teeth, and touched Tom's face. "Look at me! Stay with me!" He was grey with shock. "Hurts! I know! Breathe anyway!" She looked up. "I need splints! Now and linen!" No one moved. Then she saw why. The Duke stood 5 yards away, rigid as carved stone, one hand white-knuckled on his cane. He was staring at the boy's leg, as if at a battlefield no one else could see. Mercer hovered at his shoulder, uncertain whether to obey Caroline or wait for command. "Mercer!" Caroline barked, startling herself with the force of it. "Stable boards, belt straps, move!" Mercer moved. She cut the petticoat ties at her waist with a groom's knife, ignoring the sting as cold air hit skin, and bound Tom's leg to the splints when they came, tight enough to hold, loose enough for blood. By the time the surgeon arrived from the village, the boy was shaking but conscious, pulse stronger under her fingers. Only then did she stand, mud to her elbows, hair coming loose from its pins. The Duke was still there. His gaze shifted from Tom to Caroline, and in it she saw something she had not yet been offered at Blackthorn. Not gratitude exactly, not softness, respect stripped bare and unguarded for a single heartbeat. He inclined his head once, deeply enough that no one could mistake it. The yard noticed. After that, doors opened more quickly. A maid brought her tea before she asked. Mr. Pike sent full ledgers instead of excerpts. Even Mrs. Keating, passing Caroline in the corridor, said, "Tom will keep the leg thanks to you," in a tone that meant we saw. Not everyone approved. 2 days later, the house descended into brittle chaos at 11 in the morning because Lady Webber's carriage rolled up the front drive unannounced. She came in violet silk and winter lace, smelling of amber and expensive optimism, her smile arranged as if for an audience. "My dearest child," she cooed in the entrance hall, loud enough for 3 footmen and a maid to hear. "Marriage agrees with you. How gratifying." Caroline did not embrace her. "You should have written." "Nonsense. Family requires no appointment." Lady Webber glanced around, assessing rugs, portraits, plate on sideboards, every object converted instantly to value in her mind. "How magnificently you have landed! The Duke is with his steward." "Then we shall speak as women do." That sentence alone was warning enough to make Caroline lead her not to the blue withdrawing room where servants lingered, but to a small morning parlour with one door and no convenient eavesdropping. Lady Webber sat without invitation and flicked open her reticule. "I will be brief. There is a transfer I require His Grace to sign. Routine housekeeping." She drew out folded papers and held them delicately, as if they might stain. "Your settlement should be placed under my management for a year or 2. purely for safekeeping while you learn your responsibilities. Caroline took the papers, read the first page, and felt cold clarity settle over her like a cloak. It was no housekeeping transfer. It assigned broad authority over her personal allowance to Lady Webber as trusted familial guardian, with language slippery enough to strip Caroline's independent control entirely. No, Lady Webber's smile did not move. Read to the second page. I read it. Then you understand efficiency. You are inexperienced, and the Duke cannot— a tiny pause, sharpened like a pin— cannot be expected to monitor every financial detail. I can spare you embarrassment. Caroline folded the papers once and set them on the table between them. You may spare yourself the journey. He will not sign. Lady Webber leaned in. Do not be childish. Debts remain. Your brother's position remains precarious. If I am forced into unpleasant economies, Philip's tutor might find himself dismissed. Rage rose fast, then settled into something colder than anger. You threaten a child as if it were clever. I preserve this family. You consume it. Lady Webber's eyes hardened. Take care. London can be unforgiving to girls who overestimate their place. A duchess made in haste may be unmade in gossip. There are those who would be fascinated to hear how eagerly you secured a damaged man's fortune. Caroline's pulse beat once, hard, then steadied. She spoke softly, each word clean as glass. I would sooner burn every pound in my settlement than let you touch what my father meant for my freedom. If you speak against my marriage, you will do it without my cooperation, my fear, or my silence. And if you use Philip again to bargain with me, I will make your letters to his schoolmaster public and let every mother in Mayfair decide what sort of guardian you are. For the first time that morning, Lady Webber looked uncertain. It lasted only a second. She stood, smoothing her skirts. You are learning insolence. I am learning arithmetic. Lady Webber swept from the room with the papers still on the table. She had forgotten them in her haste to maintain dignity. Caroline waited until she heard the carriage depart before she allowed herself to sit down. Her hands were shaking. Not from fear this time, from the effort of holding the line alone. When she rose, she found Mercer in the corridor, expression professionally blank. His Grace asks if you are well, Your Grace. Not is, asks. The distinction landed oddly. I am well, Caroline said. Tell him Lady Webber has gone. Mercer inclined his head and added almost inaudibly, he did not permit her to be shown to his study. A small, unexpected warmth touched the centre of her chest. Not forgiveness, not trust, a fact she could use. That evening, unable to settle, she went to the library after supper, intending to distract herself with numbers. The main doors stood open. The inner gate she had noticed before. A narrow iron screen tucked between two cases was usually locked. Tonight it was not. A key hung in it, left as deliberately as a calling card. Caroline hesitated, then stepped through. Beyond the gate lay a smaller archive room, windowless, smelling of leather, dust, and old rain. Shelves held campaign journals, dispatch boxes, estate bundles tied by year. On a central table sat a ledger already opened, as if someone had been interrupted mid-work. She moved closer and stopped breathing. The handwriting across the page was her father's, not similar, his. The same disciplined slant, the same habit of striking a line through a mistaken figure with one decisive stroke instead of scratchings. The ledger was dated 11 years earlier. Cadiz supply accounts, with marginal notes in Latin shorthand he had used only at home. Her fingers traced the edge but did not touch the ink. Beside the ledger lay a packet of letters, sealed once and then broken, retied and untied so often the ribbon had gone soft. Each was addressed in a different hand. Miss Caroline Webber, care of Mr. Elias Weber, Lincoln's Inn Fields. She sat down slowly. The first letter began without preamble. Miss Weber, your father informs me you are 14 and insist on reading Plutarch in the original despite his warnings regarding your temper. He says you will ignore this letter if it sounds paternal. So, do not climb the south wall after rain. It drops 12 feet onto stone and would inconvenience us all. No signature on the first page, only at the end, clipped and formal. Rathmore. The second letter was 2 years later, written from Lisbon, edges watermarked. Your father continues to win arguments by pretending not to care whether he wins. I dislike this method and cannot refute it. He says you have begun keeping accounts better than grown clerks. I believe him. Then, lower, in a line pressed so hard the ink had bitten through, if he tells you I am reckless, he is right. The third and fourth shifted darker. Dates crowded close around the retreat in which her father had died. One was blotched as if folded before dry. Miss Weber, I owe you what cannot be repaid. Your father held the rear road long enough for us to clear the pass. He refused evacuation. His last coherent instruction concerned you. Caroline's vision blurred. She blinked hard and kept reading. He required my word on 2 points, that his papers and private ledgers be returned intact, and that should you be left without protection or coerced in marriage, I would offer you my name and legal security with no claim upon your gratitude. I gave that word before witnesses. It stands while I do. The final letters were never sent at all. Drafts crossed out, rewritten, kept. In them she could feel the shape of a man trying to reduce obligation to procedure and failing. I do not know whether this would be kindness or intrusion. You may refuse. You should refuse if you have a better prospect. I have no right to ask trust from one I have not even properly met. Then, in the last draft, only 2 lines, no salutation. Your father saved my life. I cannot return his, but I can keep this promise. I will not force it. I will not abandon it. Caroline sat in the archive room while the fire in the outer library burned down, and the house settled around her. Everything she had built to make sense of this marriage, transaction, debt settlement, brute necessity, tilted and rearranged. He had not selected her because she was convenient. He had waited until she was endangered enough to justify what he must have considered an intrusion, then built legal walls around her money so no one, including him, could strip it away. He had done it without explanation, without invitation to gratitude, and with a silence that now looked less like indifference and more like injury worn too long. Understanding did not erase anger. It changed its target. When she finally rose, she took nothing from the room but one folded copy of the settlement clause in her own hand, proof against her own doubt. She locked the inner gate behind her and kept the key. The Duke was in the music room when she found him, standing by the cold hearth, cane in one hand, a sheet of correspondence in the other. He looked up as she entered, saw her face, and stilled. Caroline closed the door. I found the archive room. No denial, no surprise, a tiny incline of his head. My father's ledgers are there, another incline. And your letters. His fingers tightened on the paper until it bent. He set it down carefully, as if sudden movements might break something already cracked. Caroline stepped closer, close enough to see the scar at his temple pull when he swallowed. You could have told me. He opened his mouth. Nothing came. He tried again, jaw rigid, breath uneven with effort and frustration so naked it hurt to witness. At last he reached for his folio. She caught his wrist before he could write. No! Her voice shook once and steadied. Not this time! He froze under her hand. I know now why you offered marriage. I know what my father asked of you. I know you honoured him when you had no reason to honour me." She let go slowly. "But hear me clearly, your Grace. I did not come here to be kept like a relic of his virtue. I will remain only as your wife, not your ward. If we are to share this house, it will be by choice in the present, not debt to the dead." His eyes were fixed on hers, fierce and unreadable. "I would rather face poverty," she said, each word deliberate, "than be cherished as a memorial." For a long moment, neither moved. The wind pressed once against the window panes and fell away. Then he lowered his gaze, not in dismissal, in assent, grave as a vow. He set the untouched folio on the mantel between them and left it there. He left the folio on the mantel between them and walked out without his cane. Caroline stood in the music room after the door shut, listening to his uneven steps fade down the corridor, and then return, Mercer no doubt catching up to place the cane back in his hand before any servant could witness the omission. Pride had rules in this house. So did pain. She touched the folio, but did not open it. A knock sounded, quick, controlled, the knock of someone carrying urgency on a tray and trying not to spill it. "Enter!" Mercer came in with a salver. On it lay a sealed packet impressed with Gresham's crest and marked "Immediate." Mercer's face, usually disciplined into near invisibility, was tight around the mouth. "From London, your Grace. Ryder changed horses at Penrith and again at Kendal." She broke the seal. The first page was Gresham's hand, stripped of pleasantry. "Your Grace, Lady Webber has filed petition in Chancery seeking review of the Rathmore marriage settlement and interim restraint on disbursements to your personal allowance. Grounds alleged: 1. His Grace's prolonged muteness as evidence of legal incapacity. 2. Undue influence by the Duchess in procuring recent financial documents. 3. Danger to collateral heirs should the current arrangement stand. She additionally intimates intention to challenge validity of consent under the special licence. Caroline read the paragraph twice before the words settled into meaning: interim restraint, freeze the allowance, cut off her legal independence before trial, make her dependent again on Lady Webber's terms or on Rathmore's household pity. The second page cut deeper. "I must also inform your Grace that informal briefs are circulating among interested parties suggesting the Duchess manipulated a wounded war hero for rank and capital. This line is gaining appetite in drawing rooms." She lowered the paper. "She means to unmake everything at once." Mercer did not answer. He wasn't expected to, but his gaze flicked once toward the corridor, toward where the Duke had gone, as if measuring how much damage this would do before morning. "Where is his Grace?" "In the West Study. Tell him Mr. Gresham requires an answer tonight." Mercer hesitated. "He knows." Of course he knew. The letter had likely come first to him, or to the Duke directly, before being brought to her. Blackthorn ran on channels she still only partly saw. Within the hour they were in the study together. Caroline at the desk with Gresham's pages spread before her, the Duke opposite, coat unbuttoned, one hand flat on the wood as though pinning himself to the present. Rain began against the windows in slanting sheets. Caroline spoke first. "If she persuades a court you cannot legally consent, she can challenge the marriage itself." His jaw tightened. A single nod. "She'll try for a committee over your estate." Another nod. "And if she freezes my settlement pending review, she regains leverage over Philip before we can breathe." This time he wrote, fast, hard strokes. "She already has leverage." Caroline looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" He pushed another sheet toward her. School steward replied to inquiry from Pike. "Lady Webber has paid one term and requested all notices route through her London address only." For a moment Caroline could not feel her fingers. Lady Webber had moved before she threatened, secured access, bought cooperation, closed channels. Philip would believe that meant safety. He would not see the hook in the bait. She anticipated every defensive step, Caroline said, almost to herself. The Duke wrote again. Not every. He tapped Gresham's letter where it referenced financial documents. Caroline understood. The copied ledgers, the forged debt instruments. A final note. Truth still exists. Find it before she buries it. It should have steadied her. It did, and did not. Truth existed, yes. Courts did not always care for it, if scandal proved more entertaining. By midnight, dispatches had gone out in 3 directions. To Gresham with instructions to oppose the interim freeze, to Pike for every original Webber debt paper Blackthorne had ever received in settlement, and to the village surgeon requesting testimony about Tom's accident, not because it bore on finance, but because character was already in play, and she would not be painted as predator without answer. When she rose from the desk, her back ached and ink stained the side of her hand. The Duke remained standing, reading over her shoulder. She turned. "Thank you," she said quietly. He held her gaze, his throat moved as if against an old knot. He lifted his hand, not to write, not to dismiss, just a brief, precise gesture toward the hall, toward her rooms, an instruction softened into concern. Sleep. Caroline almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Sleep, with Chancery stalking the door. But she went. By morning the house felt watched, not by ghosts, by living eyes newly hungry for misstep. 2 grooms fell silent when she crossed the inner yard. A maid she did not know curtsied, and then stared too long at Caroline's face, as if comparing it to some description purchased in London. Gossip had outrun the post. Caroline set her jaw and worked. Her plan was plain. Secure originals, build chronology, remove Lady Webber's room for invention. By noon, she and Pike had assembled a stack of account books from the townhouse years, rent ledgers, school fee notices, copies of debt renewals in 3 hands, and the transfer Lady Webber had tried to make her sign. By 2, she had drafted a statement in her own name. By 3, the plan cracked. It began with a key that would not turn. The inner gate, in the library, the one she had locked the night she found her father's ledgers, stuck halfway and stopped with a hard metallic scrape. Mercer tried after her, then swore under his breath, dropped to one knee and peered at the mechanism. "Someone's worked it," he said. "Not age, not rust. Worked." Pike fetched tools. The lock gave after 10 grinding minutes, and the gate swung inward with a jerk. The archive room looked untouched until you knew where to look. A dispatch box on the second shelf stood half an inch forward. Dust disturbed along one edge of the central table. Ribbon ends where a packet had been untied and retied in haste. Caroline crossed to the table and felt the blood drain from her face. The letters to her, Rathmore's unsent drafts, her father's mention, the promise in his own hand, were gone. Not all papers, not random theft, targeted removal. "Search," she said, and her voice sounded foreign, thin and hard. "Every shelf, every box." They searched. Nothing. Mercer turned up one thing in the hearth, ash. A torn corner with her name, only line Webber visible before the burn line. Whoever took the packet had destroyed at least part of it nearby, perhaps while sorting what to keep. Pike swore, then caught himself. "Beg pardon, Your Grace." Caroline straightened slowly. "No, keep swearing, it's honest." She forced herself to think in sequence. Who had known of the room? The Duke, Mercer, possibly Mrs. Keating by old habit. Now, perhaps, anyone bribed by Lady Webber among lower staff, or someone from outside admitted under a plausible pretext while she was in the yard or still room. "We still have the ledgers," Pike said too quickly. Caroline was already checking. Most remained. One did not, a narrow volume of correspondence receipts from the year of her father's death, precisely the sort that could verify letters sent and unsent. A thief with legal instructions, then, not a servant stealing for coin. She sent riders anyway, one to Gresham reporting theft, one to the magistrate, one to Philip's schoolmaster asking whether any messenger had called in Lady Webber's name this week. The schoolmaster's answer came the next afternoon and finished what the theft began. Madame, per instruction received under Lady Webber's seal, Master Philip was withdrawn yesterday to London for family consultation. I understood the matter agreed among guardians, and regret any inconvenience. Withdrawn, no forwarding address. The letter blurred in Caroline's hand. She read it again, as if a second pass might produce mercy. Lady Webber had Philip, not just his fees, his person, a boy of 11, earnest and loyal, now placed where affection could be weaponized by anyone patient enough to smile while tightening the wire. Caroline went to her writing desk and tried to draft immediate instructions to Gresham. The first sheet tore under her pen, the second filled with cramped, unreadable lines. On the third she managed a legible sentence and then stopped, staring at the words "my brother is in her custody," until they looked like someone else's panic. She did not cry. She had spent too many years teaching her grief to walk in public without limping. At supper she did not eat. The Duke watched, untouched plate before him, and finally pushed his folio aside. He wrote on plain paper instead of cards and turned it toward her. "We can petition for temporary ward review. If danger shown, court may place him with neutral guardian." "A neutral guardian in London takes weeks," she said. "She needs 3 hours to poison him against me." He wrote again. "Then we move in hours." She looked up. "How? She has begun before we even saw the board." His pen hovered. For once no instant answer came. His hand lowered. Caroline understood then that she was not the only one outmanoeuvred. Something in her gave way, not outwardly, not enough for servants to notice, but enough that she left the table before the final course and closed herself in her sitting room with the bolt drawn, palms pressed to the cool wood, as if holding back water. For the first time since signing the marriage contract, she let herself ask the question she had forbidden. What if I cannot protect him this time? No neat reply came, only the house breathing around her and the distant clatter of rain beginning again. Rathmore did not go to bed. At 1 a.m. he stood in the old armoury gallery, where pikes and sabres lined the walls in dead ranks, and moonlight made the steel look wet. He had come here after Spain, when sleep became a trench you fell into and woke from choking. Weapons in order calmed him, objects with names and uses, not voices. Mercer found him there and waited by the door, as he had done for years when words might be needed and not had. Rathmore dismissed him with a flick of fingers. Mercer stayed. At last Rathmore took up chalk and wrote on the slate kept for night orders. "Leave." Mercer read it, then met his eyes and signed back with 2 blunt motions they had developed long ago, half military shorthand, half private language. No, Rathmore nearly laughed, except laughter required breath in the right place, and his throat still treated breath as enemy. He set the slate down too hard. Chalk snapped. When Mercer finally withdrew, it was only after placing a glass of water on the nearest chest and leaving the door unlatched, a calculated disobedience in case the dark turned bad. Rathmore remained alone. Silence had not begun as choice. That was the part no one romanticized. After San Marcial, smoke, screaming horses, flesh burned to cloth, Elias Weber shoving him toward the ravine while refusing his own stretcher. Rathmore had spoken for 2 days in fragments to surgeons and adjutants. On the 3rd day he tried to report casualty numbers, and nothing came out but air and a sound like metal scraping stone. Men looked away in pity. One young lieutenant, drunk on fear, whispered, "The beast has lost his bark," where he thought Rathmore could not hear. Rathmore stopped trying in public, then in private, then almost entirely. Doctors called it nerves, then scarring, then stubbornness, depending on their vanity. He called it simpler names: cowardice, failure, punishment that fit the crime of surviving where better men had not. He had commanded battalions through cannon fire and could not force one syllable past an old panic clamp at the base of his tongue. 12 years of writing instead of speaking turned silence from wound to structure. Within it he could function, govern, endure, until Caroline. He crossed to the narrow table by the window where her copied account pages lay stacked from earlier work. Her handwriting was exact, even when angry. He could see where pressure deepened on certain words when she wrote Lady Webber's name. "I will remain only as your wife, not your ward." The line had landed like a blade and a blessing together. He was afraid of many things. That frightened him most, that she might yet be right to leave. Not because he had forced her here. He had not. He had made the offer under oath terms and prayed she would have better options than his name. But because he had believed duty could substitute for disclosure, had mistaken protection for partnership, had built legal walls and left emotional rooms empty, then expected gratitude for architecture. Now Lady Webber moved with courtroom knives, and the one act that might cut through her performance, his own voice, remained locked behind an old field of fire. He put both hands on the table edge, bowed his head, and tried. Not speech. First breath, in, hold, out, again. The third attempt shook. The fourth broke into a cough that tasted of old blood memory, though none rose. He waited, breathing through the surge of heat behind his eyes, and shaped the one word he had carried for weeks without sound. Caroline. His lips formed it. Air moved. Nothing audible. He slammed his fist once against the table, pain bright and immediate, better than helplessness, because it had edges. When the tremor passed, he picked up chalk again and wrote one line on the slate for morning. "Bring me every affidavit on mutinous law since 1800. If he could not yet force sound, he would at least go armed. The crisis arrived before breakfast in the person of Mr. Gresham, travel-stained and grey with fatigue, standing in Blackthorn's entrance hall as if he had outridden disaster and only just kept pace. Caroline came down, halfway buttoned, hair still damp from hurried dressing. The Duke entered from the opposite corridor, coat thrown over shirt sleeves, no time for formal armour. Gresham bowed once to each and did not sit. They advanced the hearing. "How far?" Caroline asked. 2 days. Interim application tomorrow morning at King's Bench Chambers, moved from Chancery Quay on argument of urgent risk to estate governance." "Urgent," Caroline repeated flatly. "By whose definition?" "By a judge who dines with Lady Harbury, whose daughter is intimate with your stepmother." Gresham looked faintly ill at his own candour. "I am sorry." The Duke held out his hand. Gresham passed him a packet. "Worse," the solicitor said, turning back to Caroline. "Lady Webber filed supplemental affidavits at dawn. One from a physician who examined his Grace 8 years ago and now opines prolonged muteness indicates compromised judgment. One from a former maid in your London house stating you copied figures in secret to entrap gentlemen. And—" He stopped. "And," Caroline said, "and one from Lady Webber herself alleging you threatened her with social ruin unless she surrendered guardianship of Master Philip. She requests the court place the boy temporarily under her sole authority for his moral protection." The room went very still. Gresham drew a breath. "There is also a note delivered for your Grace, marked personal. It came by separate messenger. He produced it. Caroline knew the hand before she broke the seal. My dear Caroline, you have always prized sacrifice. How touching! Attend tomorrow, certainly. Be theatrical if you like. But understand this. Courts adore a helpless child. If you force my hand, Philip may be required to testify regarding your temper and influence. Imagine what such strain does to a boy preparing for examinations. Sign enclosed transfer of your allowance to my trustees, and I will spare him appearances and unpleasant coaching. Your affectionate mother, A. Webber enclosed, was the same transfer form, revised, with a line already marked for her signature. Caroline folded the note once, very neatly, and handed it to Gresham. File this with everything else, he blinked, as evidence of coercion? As evidence she believes me still movable by fear. The Duke had been reading the affidavits. At the physician's paragraph, his scarred hand tightened until the paper trembled. He set it down and looked at Caroline. Question, warning, apology, all without words. She answered what he had not asked. We go to London. Gresham exhaled, relief and dread at once. If we leave within the hour, we reach by midnight. A footman appeared at the doorway, pale. Beg pardon. There are reporters at the gate, sir. 2 carriages and a sketch artist. Of course there are, Caroline said. Outside, wheels ground on gravel, voices carried, and somewhere beyond the yew hedge a man called, Is it true the Duke cannot answer for himself? No one in the hall moved for a heartbeat. Then the Duke picked up his cane, straightened, and signed to Mercer with crisp command. Mercer turned to the staff like a sergeant taking a line under fire. Caroline climbed the remaining stairs to fetch her gloves, each step sounding too loud in the thick carpeted hush. Tomorrow a court would decide whether her marriage was a fraud, her husband a legal child, her brother a leaver, and she herself a liar in silk. By the time she reached her room, her hands had stopped shaking. That frightened her more than anything. By dawn, London was all wet stone and rumour. King's Bench chambers had opened early, but the corridor outside the hearing room was already packed. Solicitors with portfolios hugged to their chests, peers pretending disinterest, ladies in veils that did nothing to hide their curiosity, and 3 newspapermen balancing notebooks like weapons. When Caroline stepped from Rathmore's carriage, the murmur shifted and tightened around her name. She did not look left or right. Gresham moved at her shoulder. Mercer, half a pace behind the Duke. Inside, the rooms smelled of damp wool, sealing wax, and too many people breathing in anticipation. Lady Webber sat at the petitioner's table, in dove-grey silk, chosen, Caroline guessed, for its suggestion of widowly virtue. Her counsel, Mr. Searle, arranged papers in neat, predatory stacks. On a side bench sat the physician who had sworn Rathmore incompetent, and a former maid from Lincoln's Inn Fields, with her hands knotted in her lap. Philip was not there. Caroline's throat eased by 1 fraction. The judge, Sir Alister Hume, entered with a rustle of robes and impatience. "This is an interim application," he said, before anyone could perform. "The substantive petition remains in Chancery. This urgent interim matter is before King's Bench by acceleration. We are not staging Drury Lane. Mr. Searle." Searle rose smoothly. "My lord, we seek temporary restraint over disbursements under the Duchess of Rathmore's settlement and review of the validity of consent under the special licence. His Grace has maintained muteness for 12 years. We say this indicates incapacity susceptible to undue influence by a person with clear financial motive." Caroline felt every gaze in the room swing toward her and stay there. Searle continued, "Further, we submit evidence of irregular accounting activity by the Duchess in both Webber and Rathmore ledgers, suggesting manipulation." He called the physician first. The man testified in pompous, careful phrases that prolonged muteness often accompanies cognitive decline. Gresham cross-examined and got him to admit he had examined the Duke once, 8 years ago, in a lit room for less than 20 minutes, and had never seen him manage an estate, negotiate contracts, or issue military correspondence. "Yet you infer incompetence," Gresham said. "I infer risk. From silence. From pathology." Caroline wrote one word in the margin of her notes: vanity. The former maid came next. She claimed Caroline had copied figures in secret and hidden papers from Lady Webber. Gresham asked, "Did Miss Webber keep household accounts?" "Yes." "Was she instructed to do so by Lady Webber?" The maid hesitated. "At times." "Oh, frequently?" A longer pause. "Yes." "So when you say in secret, you mean she worked in a room with a door?" Nervous laughter flickered and died when the judge frowned. Then Searle called Lady Webber. She rose like an actress entering her best scene. "I come reluctantly, my lord, as any mother would who fears for her child's safety. My stepdaughter was always dutiful, but impressionable. Since this unfortunate marriage, she has become agitated. She threatened me with social destruction if I did not yield management of family matters. I fear she is controlled by persons who exploit His Grace's condition." Her gaze slid to the Duke and away with practised pity. Caroline sat very still, while rage moved through her like cold iron. When Searle finished, Gresham stood. "My lord, the Duchess requests leave to address the court directly regarding the financial instruments at issue." Hume peered over his spectacles. "She is not called as witness." "I submit she is the only person here who has reconciled the books line by line." "Very well, briefly." Caroline rose, hands steady now because they had work to do. She carried 2 ledgers, a packet of copied debt notes, and the transfer form Lady Webber had sent yesterday. "My lord," she said, "Mr. Searle suggests irregular accounting. I agree there are irregularities. They are not mine." She opened the first ledger. "This is my father's household book from Lincoln's Inn Fields, years 3 through 6 after his death. These entries are in my hand because Lady Webber ordered me to copy debt notices, fair for her solicitor." She set down the copied notices beside the originals. "The sums match here, here, and here. But the maturity dates in Lady Webber's filed instruments have been altered forward by 6 months, creating artificial default. The ink differs. Under magnification," she slid a lens toward the bench, "you can see the overwrite." Searle rose. "My lord, this is amateur theatrics." Caroline did not look at him. "There is more." She turned pages. "These notes claim security over my father's annuity, but this annuity terminated at his death by Settlement Clause 8, which I have here certified from his solicitor's archive." She handed up the clause. "An instrument cannot attach collateral that no longer exists." Hume's brows drew together. "Mr. Searle?" Searle spread his hands. "Clerical confusion, at worst." "Clerical confusion does not explain this," Caroline said, and placed the transfer form on top. "Lady Webber presented this at Blackthorn Hall and requested His Grace's signature. It assigns control of my protected allowance to her trustees. If concern was my welfare, she could petition for advisory oversight. Instead, she drafted absolute transfer." Lady Webber snapped. "Because you are inexperienced." Caroline turned to her. "Finally, because you believed I would still be afraid." A stir ran through the benches. Searle recovered quickly. "Even if these matters are contested, the core issue remains His Grace's incapacity. He cannot testify to intent." Lady Webber leaned in, voice sharpened by opportunity. "Precisely. Someone sensible must speak for him." She stood and reached across the aisle toward Rathmore's sleeve as if to guide him up like furniture. Caroline moved before she thought. She stepped between them, caught Lady Webber's wrist mid-air and lowered it, not violently, but with unmistakable refusal. "Do not touch my husband." "Then answer for him," Lady Webber hissed. "If he can't—" Caroline felt the whole room hold its breath. This was the edge. Protect him by speaking in his place and lose him to their narrative, or trust him and risk everything. She looked at the judge. "My lord, I decline to answer for his grace. He may choose silence. He may choose speech. The choice is his." Hume frowned. "If his grace wishes to be heard, he may indicate." No one moved. Rathmore rose slowly, scarred hand white, on his cane. His face had gone pale beneath the old burn lines. Mercer took half a step forward. Rathmore checked him with one glance. He looked at Caroline first. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. When the sound came, it was rough as gravel dragged over stone, and so quiet the first row leaned in to catch it. "Caroline!" The room fractured. Gasps, a chair scraping, someone whispering God. He did not look at them. He looked at the judge and forced the next words through visible pain. "I consented." Breath. "To marriage, voluntary." Another breath, shaking. "Promise to her father. Protection, not purchase." He swallowed hard, jaw locking, then drove on. "Lady Webber, forged debts, sought transfer, coercion of boy." He lifted a hand toward Gresham. "Solicitor has records. Estate managed by me, daily. Silence is injury." He struck his chest once with 2 fingers. "Not incapacity." By the final words, sweat stood at his temple, and his grip on the cane trembled. But he remained upright. No one in that room could pretend confusion now. Judge Hume removed his spectacles, polished them with a handkerchief he did not seem to see, and replaced them with exaggerated care. "Interim restraint denied," he said. "Application to challenge consent denied on present evidence. I refer suspected forged instruments and attempted coercive transfer to Crown Inquiry immediately. Master Philip Webber is to be produced by tomorrow noon, pending review of guardianship. Mrs. Webber, you will surrender all related financial documents by 4 o'clock today." Lady Webber's composure cracked. "You cannot be serious." "I am rarely anything else." She rounded on Caroline with naked hatred. "You vindictive little—" "Enough," Hume said, voice like a gavel strike. "One more outburst, and I will have you removed." Lady Webber sat, breathing hard, face drained of colour beneath powder. Caroline did not sit. Her knees might not have obeyed if she tried. At her side, Rathmore swayed once. She reached for his arm. This time he let her. Lady Webber did not yield at 4 o'clock. She sent 3 trunks to the court offices, 2 filled with harmless correspondence, and 1 with account books so heavily altered the wet ink still shone. The key dispatch box, according to her butler, had been misplaced. Philip remained at a family friend's residence, with no address supplied. By evening, Judge Hume had issued a production order and referred the matter to Bow Street. By morning, Caroline was in a smaller, harsher room at the magistrate's court, where coal smoke seeped through cracked windows, and no one bothered with polite lies. Lady Webber arrived wrapped in sable, chin high, counsel replaced by a cheaper man with quick eyes. She had recalculated, wounded dignity now, not maternal sorrow. Magistrate Fenning tapped the table. "We are here on suspected document fraud, obstruction of court order, and unlawful interference in ward access. Mrs. Webber, where is the child?" "With friends," she said coolly. "For his peace? Name." "I decline. The press has been vicious." Fenning looked to Caroline. "Your Grace?" Caroline stood with a stack of folders tied in blue tape. "My lord, with leave, I can show why Mrs. Webber is concealing him." Fenning gestured. Proceed. Caroline laid out 3 documents: Lady Webber's affidavit, a letter to Philip's schoolmaster, and a messenger's receipt recovered by Bow Street from a coaching office ledger. In her affidavit yesterday, Mrs. Webber states she withdrew Master Philip for moral protection after hearing of this suit. The schoolmaster's letter confirms withdrawal occurred the day before the petition was filed. She turned a page. This receipt shows a private hack hired that same afternoon from London to Harbury House in Kent, under initials A.W. Lady Webber snapped, "Initials prove nothing." Caroline slid forward a 4th page. "Then this may assist. Lady Harbury's steward gave sworn statement at dawn that Master Philip arrived at dusk with instructions that no correspondence from me be delivered without your review." The Cheap Counsel jumped up. "Hearsay!" Fenning lifted a hand. "I can read sworn statements, mister." "Colt," Caroline continued, relentless now. Mrs. Webber also testified she feared financial manipulation by me. Yet this transfer deed, she held up the paper Lady Webber had sent with her threat, bears witness signatures of 2 men. One, Thomas Bell, died 9 months ago. The other, James Rooke, has sworn he never saw this instrument. A murmur rippled through the room. Lady Webber leaned forward, eyes bright with fury. "You forged that to frame me." Caroline met her gaze. "You watched me copy your debts for 4 years. You taught me every trick by using me as your pen." For the first time, Lady Webber's confidence faltered into something like fear. Fenning rapped sharply. "Mrs. Webber, answer directly. Did you or did you not instruct the removal of Master Philip to Harbury House?" Silence. "Mrs. Webber!" She lifted her chin. "I did what was required. That girl has always been unstable, obsessed with figures, resentful, theatrical. I protected the boy from her ambition. By forging dead men's signatures." Lady Webber's mouth opened, closed. No polished phrase arrived in time. Fenning wrote for a long moment, then sanded the page. "Order of this court. Master Philip Webber to be transferred immediately to temporary neutral custody under Mr. Gresham's supervision, pending full guardianship review. Mrs. Webber is remanded on financial charges and obstruction. Bail denied due to document tampering risk." Lady Webber half rose, voice breaking now. "You cannot put me in a cell like a common thief." Fenning did not look up. "Then you should have avoided common theft." 2 officers stepped forward. One touched her elbow. She jerked away, then saw no audience left to impress, and went rigid, every line of her body screaming disbelief. As she passed Caroline, she hissed low and venomous, "You think you've won because he said your name once." Caroline's answer was quiet. "No, I won because I learned to say mine." Lady Webber laughed, a thin, cracked sound, and let herself be led out. The door shut behind her. The room exhaled. Caroline remained standing until Fenning asked, more gently than before, "Would you like to sit, Your Grace?" Only then did she realise her legs were shaking. Philip arrived at Gresham's chambers just after dusk, coat buttoned wrong, hair wind-blown, trying very hard to look like a young gentleman and not a frightened child. He saw Caroline in the doorway and stopped dead. "Carrie!" She crossed the room in 3 strides and knelt to his height before she touched him. "May I?" He threw both arms around her neck so hard it hurt. "I wrote," he said into her shoulder. "They said you were ill. Then they said I mustn't upset you by writing again. Lady Harbury said if I asked questions, I'd be sent to Scotland." "You did nothing wrong." Caroline held him tighter. "Do you hear me? Nothing." He nodded against her and then, with a child's merciless honesty, whispered, "Is she in trouble?" Caroline glanced up. Across the room the Duke stood near the fire, face unreadable, giving them privacy by looking at the coals. Gresham quietly closed the door on the clerk outside. Yes, Caroline said. She is. Philip pulled back, studying her face as if taking inventory. Did he really speak? Everyone in the corridor said so. Caroline turned. Rathmore met the boy's gaze. For a beat he seemed to weigh effort against fatigue. Then, carefully, yes. Philip's eyes widened. Good Lord! Despite everything, Caroline laughed, a small, shocked laugh that loosened something knotted in her chest. Later, in the carriage back to their London house, Philip dozed with his head against her shoulder, one hand fisted in her sleeve, even asleep. Street lamps slid across the window glass in gold bars. Opposite them, Rathmore sat angled toward the door, as if still guarding exits by habit. Caroline watched his hand on the cane, raw where he had gripped it too hard in court. "Are you in pain?" she asked. He looked up, surprised by the question, as if pain were weather not worth reporting. After a moment he nodded once. "Throat!" Another nod. She hesitated. "You do not have to do that again to prove anything." He drew breath, worked past the old resistance. Not proof. Each word cost him, but they came. Choice! Had her own breath caught. Outside, London rattled on indifferent wheels. Inside the carriage, with Philip warm and alive against her, and the man beside her hoarse from fighting his way back into language, the world felt newly made and terribly fragile. At the house, Mrs. Keating, summoned from Blackthorn to manage the London staff during the hearings, met them with broth already prepared and a nursery room aired for Philip. Mercer took the Duke's coat. Caroline took Philip upstairs. When she came down again, the clock in the hall was striking 11. She found Rathmore in the library, standing where moonlight silvered the scar along his jaw. Neither spoke at once. They were both beyond heroic speeches tonight. Caroline crossed to him and set her hand over his, the one still resting on the cane. "We are out of immediate danger," she said softly. "I don't yet trust that sentence, but I can say it." He turned his hand and laced their fingers together. His voice, when it came, was rough but steady. "Thank you." She shook her head. "No, we stop thanking each other as if this were charity." A faint, weary smile touched his mouth. "Agreed." The clock finished striking. Neither let go. They returned to Blackthorn under a hard blue March sky, without reporters this time. 3 days later, at Caroline's request, the chapel was opened. Not for spectacle. For witnesses they chose only Mercer, Mrs. Keating, Gresham, Philip, solemn in a too-stiff collar, and the old rector from the village who had baptised half the tenant families and regarded aristocracy as an inconvenient weather pattern. No satin, no crowded pews. Caroline wore a simple cream walking dress and her mother's plain gold cross. Rathmore wore black coat, no orders, no decorations. At the chancel rail the rector looked from one to the other. "You are already lawfully wed," he said. "What you ask today is not legality but affirmation." "Are you certain?" Caroline answered first. "Yes." Rathmore did not nod this time. He spoke slow and clear enough to carry in the small stone space. "Yes." The service was brief. The moment that mattered came when the rector asked if either wished to add private vows. Caroline turned toward her husband fully. "I came to this marriage under coercion," she said, voice ringing a little in the chapel's hollow. "I stayed first out of duty. I remain now by choice. I will not make myself small to be easier to love, and I will not ask you to be less than whole because healing is untidy. I choose your present, not your silence, not your title, not your debt to the dead. You." Rathmore closed his eyes once, opened them, and looked straight at her. When he began, the first 2 words caught. He tried again. "I loved you." He stopped, breath rough, frustration flashing. Caroline reached for his hand. Take your time. He nodded, swallowed, and started over, each phrase built like stone laid under load. I loved you before. I knew the word for it. In the yard, with Tom, in the library, when you argued. A shadow of humour, always arguing. A ripple of relieved laughter from Philip, quickly smothered. Rathmore went on. I thought duty was safer. For you, for me, I was wrong. His thumb moved once against her knuckles. I was afraid. What if I spoke, you would hear what I wanted. And leave. Caroline's eyes stung. What did you want? His gaze did not waver. You, not as promise kept. As wife, partner, home. Silence held for one full heartbeat, warm and stunned. I'm not leaving, she said. He exhaled like a man setting down a pack he'd carried for miles too long. The rector cleared his throat into the emotion without apology. Rings? Mercer, looking profoundly invested in the floor, handed them over. When the vows were done and the signatures made in the chapel register, Caroline took the quill from the clerk herself. Her fingers did not shake. Outside, wind ran over the moor and rattled the bare yews. Philip raced ahead down the path, then turned and shouted back, Is this where I'm meant to pretend not to notice if you kiss? Mrs. Keating made a scandalised noise. Gresham coughed suspiciously into his glove. Rathmore looked at Caroline, one eyebrow lifting. Well, she said. He kissed her anyway, in full view of God, family, and a boy who whooped loud enough to startle crows from the chapel roof. In June, the gallery at Old Bailey was close and hot, flies tapping against the high windows. Lady Webber stood in the dock in plain brown silk, stripped of ornament, listening as the clerk read counts of fraud, forgery, and coercive financial misconduct. She did not look at Caroline when the verdict came. Guilty! She did look up at sentencing, fury still alive under the ruin. This is her revenge. Caroline stood beside Gresham and did not answer. Revenge required appetite. What she felt was closer to completion. Afterward, outside in hard sunlight, Gresham handed Caroline the court order placing remaining Webber assets under supervised trust until Philip's majority. She cannot touch them now, he said. Caroline read the seal, then passed it to Philip. At 12, he read slowly but carefully, lips moving on legal terms. So she can't sell father's books, he said at last. No, Caroline said. She cannot sell anything else that belongs to your future. At Blackthorn, summer turned the lower fields to bright green. Tom, legs stiff but healing, took on light, stable duties and lectured younger boys on arrogance around fresh horses. Mrs. Keating ruled both houses with benevolent terror. Mercer, promoted to estate secretary, pretended not to enjoy correcting minor lords who arrived assuming silence meant weakness. One bright morning, Caroline stood in the converted schoolroom by the east gate. Once an unused granary, now scrubbed, whitewashed, and lined with narrow desks. A painted board above the door read, Webber Foundation School for Soldiers' Children. 10 boys and 8 girls fidgeted on benches, while their parents crowded the back wall in best coats. Rathmore stood beside Caroline at the front, notes in hand. He looked down at them, folded them once, and put them away. He spoke without reading. Your parents served, he said, voice still rough in places but carrying. Some of them under me. This school is not charity. It is debt paid forward. Learn well. Ask hard questions. Do not let anyone tell you silence is the same as obedience. Caroline glanced at him, startled and proud all at once. After the children were dismissed to inspect slates and copybooks, Philip lingered at Caroline's desk, pretending to sort chalk while clearly waiting. Yes? She asked. He grinned. You used to look as if quills were swords. They are, in capable hands. He nodded toward the door where Rathmore stood, speaking with a tenant widow and her son. He said your name this morning, in front of everyone. Caroline followed his gaze. Across the yard, Rathmore looked up, as if feeling it, met her eyes, and smiled. A real unguarded smile that transformed the old scars from damage into history survived. He does, she said. She picked up the day's register and signed beneath the school charter, ink drying dark and sure under her hand. No slap. No command to be useful. Just her name, written by choice, in a room built from what had once been threatened away. Outside, the Duke called it Caroline, and this time it was not miracle, not courtroom thunder, not desperate proof, just a husband's voice across a sunlit yard, ordinary and extraordinary at once. She set down the quill and went to him.